Speaking of stolen content stuff, I want to get your thoughts on a couple other topics. You did a show with a couple retailers recently that were talking about art books and kind of the meta of, I want to lump it all together. Art books, we'll call them cosplay variants, and let's lump in as well, I guess, sort of the retailer game, online retailer game, and things like that. You don't have to summarize the whole thing, but let me ask you this. We're in a place where a lot of these variants are being made. There's a lot of companies coming up that have this business model of like, let me put it together an art book and create a variant and sell that. Or let me quickly use another IP and do a cosplay variant and get something together so I can sell that. What's your kind of thought on this? And do you feel like, does it hurt the industry at all to know that, hey, maybe it's more profitable to not make a comic book and actually just make a variant? Mm-hmm. What's your kind of thought on that whole space?
Yeah, okay, so I find this very interesting. This is one of the main reasons why I started that new show. I started a new show, I call it The Industry of Comics, where I have two great co-hosts that are longtime industry guys, LCS owners. They've been in the game for 20 plus years, both of them, and in Jesse James Comics and Wonder World Comics, Dennis Barger. The show basically is to talk about those things that happen in the industry that we might not understand as collectors. And there is a big difference in how collectors look at this and industry people look at this. Now, as a collector and a collector mindset, I have that mindset of let anybody create what they want. They're creating, that's a good thing. It's going to help the industry. Anytime somebody has a reason to sell a comic book or make somebody buy a comic book, it's a good thing. But it's created this perfect storm that's kind of happened with retailer variants, retailer exclusive variants, and the art book.
Yeah.
And we brought up the word grifter earlier. I brought up the word grifter earlier, and I hate to say it, but I am becoming more and more attuned to the fact that this is how grifters get into the temple. My co-host Dennis Barger likes to say that, this is where, you got to start flipping those tables,
Right.
And I didn't understand it for the longest time until I talked to some of these industry people. We had Brian Polito on the other night, and we asked Brian Polito about the same thing, and he gave such a great answer. And basically, if you guys don't know, Brian Polito created a character called Lady Death, and it is a huge character in comics. He also created a character called Evil Ernie. Now, Brian lost the rights to Evil Ernie in a big bankruptcy thing, and there's this whole drama behind it. So he knows what it's like to lose an IP that he's created. He's not going to let anybody mess with another IP he's created, right? A retailer out there, if you guys don't know, her name is Melinda's Comics. She kind of creates these retailer variants. I don't know if she sells or has any other comic shop, or if she sells back issues or anything. I think she just does these retailer variants. And most of the time, they're not with the big publishers. They're kind of like these art books that are coming out.
And wait, before you go on, we should really quick, in case people don't know, we should quickly just frame the cosplay variant and the art book are not necessarily comic books. On the interior pages of the art book, it's like, imagine a comic book cover, and then it's like a bunch of just your own art that you can just flip through. That's
just
inside.
Like silly things that they put. There's not a story in there. There's not sequential storytelling. There's no storytelling. It's just a reason for them to sell a cover, basically.
Right. But comic book shape presented as a comic book.
Yeah, and what will happen usually is they'll go from con to con, or they'll sell it online, and they'll use a convention as a reason to maybe make a new cover, but have the same interior pages that really have nothing in them. For the most part, they could be blank because most people aren't even opening up the quote unquote comic.
Right.
They're just buying it for the cover. And So
Okay, I
Melinda
apologize.
did,
Carry on with Melinda's comics.
yeah. So Melinda did a cosplay variant. And also to explain cosplay variants aren't usually, they have cosplay variants where it's an actual cosplayer and it's a photo of the cosplayer kind of dressed up as that. Those are real cosplayer variants. There's also a term cosplay variants for these books where they don't own the IP, but they're drawing the character and they're calling it a cosplay variant to get away in the legalities of stealing somebody's IP. So Melinda creates this cover, and it's a Lady Death looking character, and she's calling it a cosplay variant. Within, I would probably say, hours, somebody let Bryan Polito know. Bryan stopped it in its tracks. Now, we don't know what he said to her, how he reached out to her. Basically, I think he probably had a lawyer send a cease and desist letter, and maybe said we're not playing around. And Melinda was smart, and she said, "Okay, I messed up. I apologize," and backed off. Now, be- we know why, because Bryan not going to let anybody take his brand and use it in a way that he doesn't have a say in. And that's a very important thing, especially if this brand you have created and cultivated over years, 20 years, he's cultivated this brand. He doesn't want somebody coming in and doing and making booby variants that he doesn't agree with, or making, you know, uh, uh, sales off of his character. He wants to have the say, and I understand that, especially coming from the creator. But it's very interesting how the cosplay variant has gotten bigger over the years. There are so many IP infringing, content theft, cosplay variants out there that I never really saw in that light until I talked about it to industry people. That's a big deal. And there's people doing Mickey Mouse, Disney cosplay variants, Star Wars cosplay variants, Marvel and DC cosplay variants, and I'm very surprised they get away with it. I don't understand how. I mean, just the other night during a show, we're talking about New Comic Book Day, and we're going all over the new comics that are coming out. And there is a cosplay variant book that came out this week that must have 15 covers of different IP infringing theft, characters. Very obvious. It's one thing to have a character drawn that might kind of have like Rogue's, hair, piece that's kind of the white hair on and you kind of think of Rogue, or maybe she kind of has a green and yellow outfit and the hair and it makes you think of Rogue. But if you put anything X on that, or a big X-Men logo in the background and it's just kind of out of the way so you can't tell it's all X-Men, or if you put a X-Men bad guy in the background, it's too similar to me to get away with that. It feels like they're just poking the bull. They're poking the bear. They're waiting for the money. It must be so good. And that's the other thing. People are spending money on these things.
Yeah.
People, you know, uh, Ben Steiniger, who does the House of Stein Hot 10, tells me all the time, if booby books and cosplay variants were in his criteria for the hot 10 list, they would be the hot 10 books every week because they sell.
Yeah.
And that's why people still doing it. Until people start speaking with their pocketbook, or going after somebody else's pocketbook and infringing on their IP, it won't change.
Yeah.
And I look at it now as people grifting. Now, a perfect example is this. I'll do a little YouTube. Come see it on my next show on Saturday night coming up. If you guys don't know, I do a Saturday night show live at 10 p.m. Eastern on my channel called Modern Comic Mayhem. This is where I usually have my drama comic alert thing. We're going to be doing a drama alert this week on another grifter that is basically taking IP characters, stealing art from the internet, putting it through a quick AI filter to change it up just a little bit, and putting it on a comic and saying, "Hey, we're going to have these at WonderCon." Now, that's the type of thing that drives me crazy because they're just taking people's money, and these people think that some of these books have worth. Uh, I know that not every comic book collector is buying something because they think it has, worth, but these days, in the past 10 years, the majority of people who are buying comics have it in their head somewhere that, hey, they might be able to sell this thing for more than they bought it for.
Yeah.
And that's a big problem when it comes to these books because these books are worthless in my opinion.
Yeah.
It's sad.
It's interesting. I mean, again, you had such a great conversation between the two guys who
Yeah.
do the various types of these things, and it's to me what I think is so interesting. Like I'm of two minds. Like on the one hand, I think, hey, it's capitalism. You want to have a business that takes a lot of work. You want to make a product. Nothing wrong with making a product and selling it to people. And if people like it and they want to buy it, great. But and this isn't necessarily their fault. I guess where I get a little worried about it is that if it's so much more efficient and easy to get a cosplay variant cover and slap together an art book really quick than it is to actually tell a story and make a comic book. Like, it only makes sense that people are going to go to the path of least resistance
Yep.
and people are going to chase those things. Even artists themselves. I mean, how many
Yes.
artists today would rather just do variant covers than do sequential art? So many.
Scotty Young, J.
Yeah,
Scott
all of them.
Campbell,
Like,
Granov.
because it's
Yeah.
just so much more efficient for them to do it. And then soon, maybe they'll be the ones that be like, hey, you know what? I should just make art books with cosplay
Yeah.
variant covers and things like that. And ultimately, I think it just leads to sort of a worse state of the industry. Now, I
Yes.
can't say that it's anyone's fault. I can't necessarily say that they shouldn't be doing this because, hey, like if that's their business or whatever, I think it's like a little bit of like a black pill, you have to sort of take where it's like, oh, okay, I guess this is where it's going.
Well, I part of it, I do put blame partly on the big publishers.
Mm,
Not because they're not going after these people, because they're not writing good stories. They're not creating good comics, right? If the interior, okay, here's a perfect example. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, when I got into comic books and I spent all my days at the local comic shop and this and that, there was two books to have at that time where if you didn't have these books, you weren't, or if you weren't trying to get these books, you weren't a real comic collector or you weren't a real comic fan. It was, of course, Amazing Spider-Man 300, but even more importantly and more coveted than the first appearance of Venom, it was Daredevil 158. Now, for those of you guys that don't know, Daredevil 158 isn't a huge key when it comes to a character or a storyline. It is a wanted book because it's the first time that Frank Miller took over and started doing Daredevil, right? I don't think he was writing it. I think he was drawing it at that time. But Frank Miller went on to change the comic world because of his Daredevil stuff. So everybody wanted the first time Frank Miller did Daredevil in the Daredevil series, right? 158 was such a high valued book. It was that grail. 158 now isn't even thought of in that category.
yeah.
Like the only people that really think about that book are creator fans, And the reason is, in my opinion, is because the writing game has taken a back seat to the art in even a bigger way. I think the art has always been the top dog when it comes to comics. It's always been about the art for the most part. But writing propelled it into the mainstream with stories from Frank Miller, Alan Moore, Mark Waid, uh, you know, Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns, Swamp Thing, Daredevil. All those series were important because of the writing, the
Yeah.
story that it told. And it changed and made comics change from a kid's book to adults reading it. There's no comic, there's sorry, I shouldn't say that. for the most part, the vast majority of comics created to these days aren't for kids, and kids are not reading comics. Uh, that's obvious. So I feel like if the big publishers were paying more attention to what the stories and making sure that good writers were writing comics, we wouldn't have so much emphasis on art books or variant covers, right? Variant covers dominate the industry right now. If
Yeah. Yeah.
if it weren't for variants, comics might be dead. I mean, I feel like variants kind of brought it back in this big way, and it saved a lot of publishers. But if that wasn't going on, what will we be talking about? There's very few books that we talk about because of the story. It's
Yeah.
always about, oh, did you this cover is this book is hot because of the cover. That's why. And that's the publisher's fault, in my opinion.